All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to speak with you. I hope I don't dash any expectations this evening. Don, can you see my screen now?
We can. We can't see you though, so I don't know if you want to share your video or not, or start your video.
Yes, start my video.
There you go. Now we can see you. Perfect.
All right, guys. Well, yeah, so again, thank you for having me this evening. I hope what I'll be able to share is worthwhile. As I go through this, because this isn't not a very interactive format, I'm hoping that, again, you'll feel at ease sending some questions through the message board to Dawn, and she can kind of help communicate things. So I have to admit, I haven't spent a ton of time in the show industry, so I hope you'll bear with me on that. But I think there's a lot of good principles that can be applied, and some of these things, again, we'll talk about different stages of the animal, but I think they all apply to market lamb management. And so we'll talk a little bit about some housing considerations, what is the right temperature for our sheep, and how we can kind of improve some of the major health issues. Now, we could spend a series of 20 webinars on all the health issues we can experience, but I've tried to boil it down to some of the most pertinent. So with that in mind, I'll try not to get too technical, and if I am getting too technical, someone send me an angry look, so that way I can fix it. All right. So why good facilities? I think we're all aware that we need to have good facilities. Otherwise, we don't have a lot of fun raising market sheep, right? Again, a lot of us are in small operations, so these don't have to be fancy, but the time that you spend and your parents spend working the sheep should be enjoyable. We do what we do because we love it, and I hope that you can keep that in mind, that having good facilities helps keep good attitudes and good feelings towards what we're doing. But also it comes down to being safe. And so I know many of us probably have a handful of market lambs. Some of us may even have a flock, but a good thing to remember is that our facilities need to be versatile enough that we can do various tasks with them, and that the take up and set up should not be hours and hours of work. And so I'd like you all to think about your current facilities and how you either house your sheep, or when you have to work them to give them a vaccination or a drench for a dewormer. What are some things that you think you can improve? And I'll ask that question. I hope we'll all be thinking about some ideas as to where we can improve in our facilities. When we think of all the tasks that we do, again, some of us don't have hours and hours worth of working our sheep, but again, a holding pen, the task that we deal with when we're using our holding pens, should be a gathering and forcing pen. When we sort our sheep, we should have a good sort gate that isn't loud, that isn't going to hurt the sheep if we're sorting them. Probably most important and pertinent to you folks in the market lamb side of things is having a 3-foot wide chute or a small pen, so that those animals, when you have to give them a shot or you have to put a drenching tube down their mouth, that they can't flail around and hurt themselves. And so that dimension is a really good rule of thumb. A 3-foot wide chute can oftentimes keep them from banging around and fighting too much. Our weigh crates, again, probably some of us don't have those, but the point I want to really emphasize is that no matter how many sheep we're working with in our market lamb project, the importance of safe facilities that help us enjoy the process is really important. When you look at the various housing space requirements, now thinking a little bit about how we manage our sheep, Dawn, I'm going to move this window I don't have a good place for it. I might just close it. Darn it all. Okay, there we go. This is a really good space requirement, and I assume this will be presented for you guys, but as you design and build your handling facilities, and especially your holding facilities for various stages of production, there's some really good square footage requirements or recommendations that are given, and that allows us to make sure that we have enough space for our sheep. You can see that column all the way over at the very end calling feeder lambs. You can call those market lambs. And you can see that in terms of building floor space, many of you guys are going to have a solid floor. So you can see that 8 to 10 square feet for a feeder lamb is pretty important so that they have adequate room when you're not exercising them and when you're not getting them out. You can see some of those other requirements as well. Some really helpful things is you think about watering space. If you have perhaps a breeding flock project, it's really important to have as much open space for the water as possible. You can see that the water bowl should be about 50 to 75 square inches, so that you can ensure that they're not having to fight. We all know that sheep,
I took 2 screenshots on your phone.
they really are gregarious creatures. They want to be together, and so oftentimes their feeding behavior and watering behavior is dependent on their pen mate or their flock mates. And so it's really important that we don't limit that space too much. And so this is a good diagram for you folks to use as you perhaps think about improving your facilities. Now I throw this up there, bear with me. This shows a bunch of the different sheep breeds we work with. And I understand that a lot of us are working with our Suffolk Hamp type breeds or Southdown type breeds. But when you think about the behavior of your sheep are awesome creatures because they really behaviorally, once we understand what they're all about, we can do a better job of making sure that we take care of them. This shows a diagram, and there's going to be some odd words at the bottom. The words that say strongly gregarious or weakly gregarious. Gregarious just means that they like to be together, okay? So those breeds that are strongly gregarious, the Rambouillet, the Columbia, the Targhee, the Merino, those are all breeds of sheep that we can induce a whole lot of stress if we try and isolate them and keep them by themselves. Now, we often refer to some of our black-faced breeds or our terminal sire breeds as less wanting to be together in the flock than our white-faced breeds, but still there is a gregarious aspect or a want to be with their flock mates that's still pretty strong in certain scenarios. And so hopefully many of you have at least 2 sheep that you can keep in a pen to keep each other calm and to keep each other happy. But remember that when we work our sheep, whether it's one or a handful, that keeping in mind that flocking instinct or how gregarious they are is pretty important. Now, I don't know if any of us have any American or Border Leicesters or Lincoln long wools, but those are probably our most solitary breeds of sheep. Those evolved in Northern Europe in very, very large pastures where they're pretty used to being by themselves and they don't have as strong a flocking instinct. Thinking about bedding options, I know a lot of us probably don't have all of these listed here, but what's really important is we understand that we bed our sheep not only to keep them warm, but also to keep them dry. And we'll talk about the importance of keeping all stages of sheep dry. But you can see that when we use a certain type of bedding, certain bedding has greater absorbency than others. Probably some of the best options that you can have are sawdust options or our shredded wood options. Again, those have great absorbency factors, but they also have the ability to keep those nasty bugs that like to get passed in through the feces and through water at bay. Knowing that if you're able to, in certain cases, bed so that you can insulate your sheep and keep the level of bedding high enough that it can cut down on some of that wind speed in a barn, because even in all of our barns, they're not perfectly insulated. Understanding that keeps the heat loss from the ground level, but also on the exterior of the sheep. I throw this picture up here because I want us all to be thinking about the facilities that we have. This picture is taken from the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, and it's probably one of the most impressive lambing systems that I've seen. But again, whether we're housing our sheep for market lambs or lambing facilities, there's one, I think, universal principle here, and that's the benefit of sunlight on a south-facing slope. This is one of their lambing sheds, and you can see those clear roof panels there that allow light to come in. That is the best this time of the year, especially those of us that are looking forward to weaning or getting through lambing, understanding that solar heat that is produced that can be generated within the barn, and as a result of that solar south-facing roof line can really help keep our barns warm, cut down on draft, but also it dries out our barns. if there's anything that you walk away with tonight as you think about how you house your sheep, is keeping things dry as possible is critical. Because all those nasty pathogens and even parasites that we deal with, their only way of surviving is through having moist conditions. And so whether we're bedding or we're designing our facility or whether we're mucking out our pens every once in a while, it's just really important that we have a well-drained, dry facility to keep our animals as healthy as possible. All right, let's talk about water. Now, many of you, as you look at this table, I have it broken down into different stages of production. All right, we have some ewes in the middle there. Maintenance refers to when she's not raising any lambs. Probably the most pertinent row is the feeder lamb table there. This tells us how many how much water they're generally going to consume on a given day. Now we know that if it's hot and we've been exercising our lambs, those market lambs can definitely consume over 2 gallons a day. But generally speaking, their requirement is going to be from 3/4 of a gallon up to 2 gallons. Now we want to make sure that we always have an abundant supply of water. I throw this up here not to say that we should always precisely measure out 2 gallons a day, but it's really important that we provide more than they're going to consume. So these are the baseline requirements, but if you exceeded these by a half gallon or a gallon, that will keep your bases covered. Sheep, again, they're very, very interesting from a behavioral standpoint. They like being together, but also they're very selective. Not only the feed they eat, but the water they eat. And many of you in the audience, I want you to think, how many times a day do you clean out your water trough or your water bucket? Or at least check it. Now, hopefully a lot of you are thinking, well, I do it at least once a day. That's good. Understanding that oftentimes sheep won't pay attention and they may poop in their water bucket, or they might kick up some dust, or you might even have some water, some birds get water out of your watering system, and it's really important that we keep that clean because the pathogens, and especially a nasty organism called coccidia, can be spread from other bird species, and it's really critical that we keep our water sources nice and clean. Now, our water intake is always going to go up as temperature increases, but also remembering that if you have pasture, and some of your animals, most of you are going to have your animals dry lotted, but maybe some of you every once in a while you'll allow them to graze some of that lush green grass that hopefully we're going to see here in a couple of months. Just know that if they're grazing green grass, there's a lot of water in that, and so don't get too worked up if they're not consuming the levels that I'm mentioning here. Just know that generally speaking, 2 gallons, providing 2 gallons per lamb per day is going to keep your bases covered, and it may go down if they have a lot of feed with a lot of water in it. Now, hopefully many of us are looking forward to warmer temperatures, but I think it's really important, a really good consideration to keep in mind as we talk about that perfect temperature for sheep. Now, all of us probably have a perfect temperature that we enjoy, right? Because some of us like the heat, some of us don't like as warm temperatures. But sheep have a thermoneutral range, and what that means is there's a perfect range from 24 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit where sheep are most comfortable. If we go below 24 degrees, sheep are going to have to rely on the feed that they eat to produce the heat to keep them warm. Okay, and if we go over 66 degrees, they're going to have to increase how quickly they breathe, and they're going to have to dissipate that heat a little bit more. So know that obviously 24 to 66, very rarely are we perfectly within that range, but it's really important to remember if it gets really cold, we have to increase that feed. If it exceeds that perfect temperature, we need to provide shade, we need to provide some ventilation, and especially water. Generally speaking, I mentioned this before, but after we shear our market lambs, and Don, I'll let you chime in, you can help educate me a little bit. Do we keep them in the fleece until they get a little bit closer to fair time?
A recommendation would be is that they could stay in fleece until about the first part of June, and then at that point they probably should rough cut them out. That doesn't mean they have to shear them tight like with a surgical blade like they would for show, but they could get rough cut them out so that it just helps take them down. So somewhere this year, maybe a little later, right? It's really cold out. But typically when it starts warming up, that first part of June, we recommend try to get them sheared for the first.
Thank you. So again, remembering that the length of the wool, even though we don't usually look at our market lambs, especially our blackface breeds for producing great wool, this time of the year, that is probably the best insurance policy we have from cold stress, and making sure that we don't take that wool off too soon. And also remembering that not only does wool keep the sheep warm, but it also keeps them cool in the summer months. That nice barrier that they have allows them to hold, allows them to keep themselves from very extreme radiant heat. So just remember that strategically removing that wool, as Dawn mentioned, is going to be good as we get out of these cooler temperatures, but definitely not being too quick to remove that insulative barrier too early in the season. Now we know the wind blows in Wyoming, and so I always get a kick when we talk to our sheep production kids at school here that anytime that we usually exceed 25 miles per hour in the wind, that fleece can part and the heat is moved away from that animal's skin surface. And so just remember that wind is especially not our friend when sheep have been shorn. Yes.
Can I just add in there, some of you kids that maybe are getting lambs right now, maybe it's out of your control, which means that maybe you're purchasing lambs like at these sales, or there's a lot of options out there to get animals right now. And if they come to you without it now, is that it's important that you do manage that in terms of putting a blanket on them or a slinky or something like that to maintain some heat in there. So I know that for some kids, it's out of your control of when that lamb maybe first initially got sheared because you're buying it at a sale or something.
Great point. Absolutely. And especially if they have the wool knocked off them, again, having a good facility that cuts down on the wind speed so that you can keep them out of the wind. Again, I'll show you in a minute how that affects it, but let's talk about heat stress for a minute. All of us can appreciate that from time to time we're going to have some pretty high temperatures this summer before our fairs and our exhibitions. Remember that the normal temperature range for sheep is 100.9 to 103.8, okay? Give or take a couple tenths of a degree. And oftentimes you all should be experts after tonight to understand that when a sheep is breathing fast, that's how they dissipate their heat. And so a good experiment for you to keep kind of an idea of how your sheep are doing in terms in those hot summer months is looking at their rate of respiration. And I think we've all seen sheep breathe pretty fast before, but once we start getting over 80 breaths per minute, 80 to 100, generally speaking, those sheep are having to dissipate a lot of heat. And so we might want to think about some shade options and also just double check that we have water. If we get over 200, they have severe heat stress, and that is not good for our sheep. It can be a real problem for us in those summer months. But just know that if they increase their respiration rate, that's how they're trying to cool off. Now, Dawn, you'll forgive me because I should have just focused on the market lamb stuff, but I think maybe there's some people that are raising some younger lambs, but I think these same tenets of lamb survival apply to keeping our market sheep healthy. The four most important tenets that I've come across both here in the U.S. and internationally is the importance of keeping our lambs dry. We reduce that thermoneutral range when they get wet, and their ability to keep themselves warm is diminished, or they can't do a good job keeping themselves warm when they're saturated. Keeping lambs full, especially those lambs that are up to 30 days of age, making sure that their moms are still producing milk. And this is probably one of the trickier points to remember, is that those ewes that are raising those lambs oftentimes can get bacterial infections in their udders, and they stop producing milk, or just genetically they may stop producing milk. And so really we have to make sure that they're still getting adequate feed from the milk to also help keep them warm. And then the most important is keeping lambs out of the wind, and keeping our market lambs out of the wind, especially in these spring months where we still may have a couple of cold snaps ahead of us. It's really important that we cut down on that heat loss. obviously we never have the ideal temperatures, but I show this, that the perfect temperature, if we could dictate the weather, would be 77 degrees without any wind or moisture, right? But we can't get that lucky. We know that as little as 40 degrees with greater than a 15-mile-an-hour wind will rapidly induce hypothermia in these newborn lambs. Of course, this is not the case when these lambs are 60 to 80 pounds. But just remember, those of you who are raising newborn lambs this time of the year, that if you can cut down on the wind and keep those lambs dry, your ability to be successful and help those lambs be successful is greatly increased. Many of you may have had an experience raising lambs so far where you noticed the lamb wasn't eating anything, he went off feed, he looked ill, and you weren't really sure what was happening. And I think all of us, parents forgive me, could invest in a pretty cost-effective thermometer. When we estimate what the temperature of our animals are, we put that thermometer, the tip of the thermometer in the rectum, and we can at least determine what's going on with some of these sheep, okay? When they exceed 104 degrees Fahrenheit is their body temperature, we know that there's some kind of infection going on, whether it's a bug that they're experiencing, whether it's a virus, but we know that if it's exceeded 104 degrees, that they're trying to fight off whatever it is that they've been infected with. When we go below 102, we start to drop off in that body temperature, and those are some indications of hypothermia. Again, this is probably not going to be a concern to you folks in May and June, but just remember that just a very quick purchase of a thermometer can help at least let you know what you're dealing with, well, whether it's an infectious organism or you're dealing with hypothermia. Now, I'm not going to talk a ton about nutrition, but I want you all to be thinking a little bit about, especially those of you who are raising your own lambs, and even some of you who are buying them, that we really don't expect our sheep to be on full feed until about 50 to 60 days, okay? Now, we can put in a nice creep diet with our lambs, and they will consume some of it before that 50 or 60 days. But generally speaking, they're highly reliant upon their dams to give them the milk that they need. And so it's really important that we have a good creep diet available immediately in that first week of birth so that they can start developing their rumen more rapidly and can get on full feed more quickly. Dawn, did you have something to chime in? I'm getting feedback.
You don't want to go with that.
Okay, I think we're good. So again, I'm going to ask you, if you guys are in front of me right now, I'd ask you, do sheep like to be alone or do they like to be together? And hopefully everyone would respond, well, they like to be together, Whit. And so a really way to understand if we're dealing with some sick lambs before we even collect the temperature is to look at their behavior. If they separate themselves, we have a good indication that they're going to be not feeling well, right? And so when I say lethargy, they look tired almost. Their eyes aren't bright and open. They're not very attentive. Oftentimes, if they're cold and not feeling well, they'll arch their back. The droopy ears and a snotty nose can also tell us that
You're on your phone.
But it's really important.
Wait, just a minute. Let me see if I can get this muted. Sandra Brown, I think it's you. Can you mute yourself? For some reason, I can't. Okay, there we're better. Okay, go ahead, Whit. Sorry.
All right. And so all you kids out there, remember, you're the experts. You spend all your time with your lambs, and you should be paying attention to if they don't run up to you when you come out to the pen, or if one is removed from the group. Those are all signs that the sheep is trying to tell you that it's not feeling good. And sometimes people that don't understand sheep will say, oh, sheep, they like to die too easy. But sheep are really tough that they wait until the very last minute before they start showing you how bad they're feeling, okay? They support not feeling bad for a very long time. And so keeping in mind these signs that they're trying to tell you are really important. Every day that you feed, if you go out and you fill up the trough, or you feed them the specified amount that you feed them at each feeding, if you notice that they don't clean it up consistently, or they just leave a whole bunch in the trough, you should know that there's something wrong immediately, okay? And it's important that we don't get too worked up, that we pay attention. And so that when we work with our veterinarian, we can tell them, well, you know, he had a temperature this day, or he started removing himself from the group this day. And all those pieces of information really help your veterinarian or your county agent, your educator, to make sure that they can help you more effectively. Many of you are going to be purchasing lambs from a grower. Some of you may be raising your own, but this is probably the most important organism that we deal with that is of greatest risk to us raising market lambs, and that's Clostridium type C and D. This is often referred to as overeating disease. And what happens is all these bacteria that are in the gut of the sheep, the hind gut of the sheep, and the intestines, these bacteria, if we change the diet abruptly or they haven't been vaccinated, those bacteria can grow really quick and produce toxins that can kill our sheep. And many of you hopefully haven't seen this, but sheep affected with Clostridium type C and D oftentimes will lose control of their neck, okay? Because those nasty toxins that the bacteria produce, once they've gotten to be such high of a level, will cause that animal to lose control of its head. And so the most important thing you can ask when you go to buy those lambs is when that Clostridium, or the CD and T vaccine, as we often refer to it as, was administered, okay? Generally, we do that 2 to 6 weeks prior to lambing, all right, because all of those protective antibodies are transferred in the colostrum to that newborn lamb. And that lamb has coverage for about 6 to 8 weeks of age, until at which point we need to boost her with a CD and T vaccine of our own. Now, there's various trade names of the vaccines on the market. I think all of them do a pretty good job. My preferred vaccine is a Covaxin 8. That provides a good broad range of coverage across all Clostridium perfringens species. So those bad bacteria, that vaccine gives us a lot of coverage. But what's most important is we ask those questions. When was the ewe vaccinated for CD and T? And that should be a priority when we bring them back to our operations. A really, really good rule of thumb with preventing CD and T, of course, is giving them the vaccine. But if we know that we're going to transition them onto a diet in 2 or 3 weeks, or a hotter diet, or a diet with more protein or energy, know that those times when those lambs are most susceptible to this bacterial species is when we're changing things up, okay? And so it's really important that we ask those questions and are pretty aggressive in our vaccination protocol for Clostridium type C and D. Dawn, is there anything that I should be mentioning on that from a 4-H'er perspective?
Nope, I think
that's really clear.
Yep, you got it, good.
Okay. So I know you're probably rolling your eyes saying, oh boy, here comes a professor with his figures again. But I want you to look at this, because these are pretty good studies that have been done that show us why we do what we do. A lot of the times at the university, we have to research something to know whether it's worthwhile telling you to do it or not. And what you can see is that those antibodies, or those protective organisms in the animal that keep that animal protected against these nasty bacteria, the top graph shows ewes that were vaccinated and those that were non-vaccinated. And you can see that weeks from that middle line there that says 0, you can see the coverage that is given to those ewes when they were vaccinated in pregnancy. But most important is looking at that top line underneath the lambs category. You can see that when we make sure that we vaccinate those ewes, we make sure that we protect those lambs. And that's really, there's a lot of questions I get from producers throughout the state. They said, oh boy, Whit, I forgot to vaccinate my ewes for CD and T. And I said, make sure you give them a booster at 3 to 4 weeks. If you had vaccinated the ewes, I'd say give them a booster at 6 to 8 weeks. But it's just really important that we ask those questions and make sure that the ewes were administered a good CD&T vaccine late in pregnancy. All right, who wants to talk about worms? Hopefully everyone ate dinner. Okay. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about worms because oftentimes you wonder, do I need to deworm and what should I use? So I'm going to tell you about the worm species that gives everybody the most problems. But before I tell you about that, I want you to raise your hand. And I know I can't see everyone here. I can't see anyone, actually, if I'm being honest. But I want you to look at your parents or look at your brother and sister as I ask this question. Are you grazing any grass on your property from irrigated sources? So are you grazing some lush green grass that gets wet when you water it? Okay, that's the real question that we need to keep an eye on, because the major worms of concern for us are these stomach worms, the barber pole worm. And this isn't something that you can see in the poop, all right? This is something that is a really dangerous organism that can be picked up, especially if we're grazing pastures. So the barber pole worm, oh boy, what happened there? Huh. All right. Don, I don't know. There we go. All right. So it is the most important worm problem that we have that we need to keep an eye on. And the reason this worm is so deadly is because it eats a tremendous amount of the blood in the sheep, all right? It goes and lives in a part of the stomach that's really important for that animal, and it's really good at drinking a lot of blood, okay? I know it's kind of gross sounding, but sheep that are really sick with this have about 5,000 worms in them, and they consume about a cup of blood a day, those nasty little critters. And so just know that the barber pole worm is probably the greatest problem that we have. You know, if we think we have a problem, of course, we should talk to our 4-H educator or our ag educator, and they can kind of work with us on how we can take a fecal sample. But I'll tell you right now that not all drugs are working if we have issues with worms, and so I'm going to show you some that do work. But know that the reason this is such a problem is you can see that nice droplet of water, and you can see all those worms on it. The way that this organism infects sheep is it lives on the blade of grass in those really humid portions of the grass. And when we get a heavy dew or whether we've irrigated the pasture, those little worms, the larvae, they crawl up that stem and they just hope that they get eaten up by a sheep, okay? And so that's why I tell you, if you've dry lotted your sheep and they're not out there grazing some lush, wet pastures, generally speaking, 90% of the time, you're not going to have a heavy burden from those sheep unless they brought it with them from where you bought them, which oftentimes can be the problem. They like to inch up this grass so that they get eaten. I mentioned that. But just know that even if we do worm and we turn our sheep back out into an infected pasture, those sheep can consume that worm again, and we can have the problem all over again. So it's really important that especially for our market lambs, which I can understand, we're probably not turning them out to graze, but if we have other sheep that have been grazing, there's a potential that we can infect our pastures with it. These are kind of, I show this picture because these are the problems where we see the major worm issues in our area, okay? These are irrigated pastures where these nematode species can crawl up the grass, they hatch out of their fecal pellets, and they have a really hospitable environment. So I realize that not a lot of us are raising market lambs in this environment. But a really good rule of thumb in which you can check the status of your sheep, whether they're anemic or not, is called the Fumancha system, okay? And what this does is we pull down that lower eyelid to expose that membrane, and we compare it to these various stages of these various color schemes, okay? You can see on this graph here with the skull and crossbones, when it's a 5, that means that those organisms have eaten a lot of blood from that poor sheep, and it's very anemic. It doesn't have a lot of red blood cells, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, when you have a Fumancha score of a 1, it shows that animal's not fighting any infection from the barber pole worm. And so, generally speaking, we hold up this card that we can find online, or we're going to be doing some trainings this summer that you can use this as a system to determine if you have an issue with worms, and it tells you whether you need to treat or not. Okay, so this is a selective deworming tool that allows us to just not mass treat everything, right? Because we can never get rid of all these bugs. They're becoming resistant, and they can also just be picked up again in the pasture. So really, it just eliminates and determines those that are really sick. Here's another way of showing how it's done. You push over that top eyelid and pop down that bottom eyelid. I promise you, you're not going to hurt the sheep. And you expose that lower membrane, and then you compare it to the color on the chart to tell you whether you need to treat it or deworm it or not, okay? Here are some other signs of whether you have a parasite issue, okay? And I put these up here because, again, all you kids out there, there's nothing better than spending time with your sheep and getting to know them, right? And if they start to act off or they look different, those are all really good signs for us to make sure that we can treat them in a timely manner, okay? So if we see a lot of dirty back ends or diarrhea, that doesn't always mean it's parasites, but it could very well be. Bottle jaw is an image I'm going to show you in a second, but if their coat looks off, their hair coat looks chalky, their fleece looks open, and they just don't look right to you, those are all signs that there may be something going on. This is probably the most obvious sign that we may come across. It's called bottle jaw. Because those worms are eating a lot of that blood and messing up their stomachs, we see a lot of interstitial, or we see a lot of accumulation of fluids underneath their jaw there, okay? And so if you see that in your sheep, you know you have a problem. So now you're asking, well, what do we do, Whit? Well, there's another one for you to look at. This is probably one of the most severe cases I've seen. This is out of Australia. So you have all these products, and if you don't have a lot of sheep, you probably don't want to spend a lot of money on something that's not going to work. And so we're doing a lot of research here at the university for those of you that do raise sheep on irrigated pastures where parasites like to live, that we can give you the right product so that you know that it's going to kill all those worms, okay? And again, I don't promote any product over the other, but we've been doing some testing to see which drugs are killing those bad worms. And so we're working on our third year of a study. If there's those of you in the audience that do run sheep on irrigated pastures, we'd love to get you involved. Don, we need to get you involved this year so that we can tell you what products still work. So we've sampled those from various farms and ranches across the state. And what I want to show you is that out of all those ranches we sampled, even in our area in the Intermountain West, where it's not always warm all year round, that barber pole worm represents the majority of our problems, okay? And so one product that we're not sure we're pretty sure is not working very well is our benzimidazoles, okay? I show some products in the background. I don't want to get in trouble with any pharmaceutical companies, but those are the trade names, okay? If you look at the active ingredients, you can see that they're albendazoles or benzimidazole is the class of family. But what I'm trying to show you here is that they just aren't killing worms anymore in our area. So those chalky white dewormers, the valbazin especially, unfortunately, as we've sampled those ranches, we found that 83% of them, there's a high degree of resistance, which means they weren't killing those nasty bugs. Our levamisols, again, this is probably not a product that I'd recommend that young folks work with, and it's probably not worthwhile, so I'm going to skip it for you. That's a compound that is a similar compound is used in chemotherapy, and so it's one of those that can be a problem. All of these products, folks, we need to remember that we have to work with our veterinarian, because when we give these products to the animal, they stay in their tissues for a while, okay? And if we overdose them, we extend how long that chemical is in their system. And if we underdose them, then we're not killing those worms. So it's really important that we work with a professional and we use the label accordingly. Drenches, or when I say drenches, those are the ones that you draw up in a large syringe and you squirt down their mouth, okay? Those are the only products approved for sheep in our region. I know a lot of times we sometimes will use injectable products, but those are not labeled. Those are extra label products that we really absolutely have to use a veterinarian as we work on those. So getting back to this, Ivomec, it could have different names, doramectin, ivermectin, but what we found is about half of those ranches, the worms are still being killed by Ivomec when we give them this drench. And the only real home run that we've seen so far is what is called a moxidectin. I'm not sure if there's any other pharmaceuticals developing this beyond the trade name of Cydectin. Doramectin may be similar, but amoxidectin has been shown to kill the worms from the ranches that we sampled. And so, again, if we do have a worm issue, we can pull a fecal sample, send it to our vet lab or a veterinarian. They can tell us if we have an issue, and it's really important that we use a product that works. And so our ivermectin and our amoxidectins are still really effective. Now, one thing to keep in mind, many of us may be buying sheep out of state, okay? What I have found as I've talked with folks and sampled some of these operations is that as you go east and it gets more humid and we get more rainfall, we go into areas that have a very aggressive type of barber pole worm that is very resistant to a lot of the products that we have. So when we bring in our market lambs, or if we buy some ewe lambs for a breeding flock, it's really important that we use a product that cleans out those sheep before they start shedding any resistant worms onto our pasture. Right now, they recommend if you buy from a flock and you're pretty sure they're resistant, I'd encourage you to use amoxidectin, but oftentimes they will do a combination drench, which means you take 2 different dewormers, give them the full amount, and that way those resistant worms that may be resistant to one of the products generally are not resistant to the other. So it's a way to clean out those sheep and make sure that you're not bringing resistant organisms onto your operation.
So Whit, there's a question in the box. Do you want it now?
Sure.
It says, can you worm a nursing sheep?
No, that is not recommended. Again, remember that those lambs can only be infected by consuming an infected feed source, okay? So those newborn lambs, generally speaking, until 60 days of age, they're not really consuming enough to make a difference. So if you are going to treat a younger lamb, make sure it's a minimum of 60 days of age. And generally, you can see the dosage amount is about 3 mils per 100 pounds of body weight. You can estimate that with the help of your veterinarian or your 4-H educator so that you're giving it the proper dose. But once they get a fully developed rumen and they start eating out on pasture, we do need to make sure that we treat those lambs. But before 60 days, it's just probably not the right strategy for us.
Perfect, thanks.
All right. So I guess we can open it up for some questions now. Don, I know there's some other thoughts that you might have or some clarification, or anyone in the audience. I'm happy to address some of those.
No, I think this is your guys' time. Does anybody have questions for Whit in terms of health management type things or housing, or questions that you have? Many of you guys are in the mode that you're gonna start getting lambs soon, and this is kind of your time to be able to ask Whit those questions. Anybody have questions?
So I guess while people they're coming in, I'll answer one that I know that's going to come in there is, if I have a sick sheep, what do I give it, right? And I think sometimes the tendency is to want to diagnose and provide the treatment ourselves. And I just can't emphasize enough having a good relationship with your veterinarian. There's a reason why they're out there. And, you know, I can speculate and give you some ideas as to treatment, but again, I'm not a veterinarian. I think one important thing to keep in mind is that you develop that relationship probably even before you get the lamb, introducing yourself and having someone in your hometown that you could let them know what you're dealing with. And I'm always happy to chime in on some of those specific animal health issues. I do that a lot. But I try to work really closely with our veterinarians because they're the professionals in the area. So, you know, maybe visiting them and asking them, what things should I have on hand? I think having some antimicrobial or some antibiotics on hand are good. The class that your veterinarian's willing to suggest for you, they're going to be different. I also think having a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, a flunixin or a benamine, are good ways to keep our sheep, when they are fighting a disease, to keep them comfortable and eating. I think that's really important. But all those products have to be purchased with a relationship with your veterinarian. And those relationships can be different, but I just can't emphasize that enough.
All right, so there are some questions then. There's a follow-up question to the worming question about the nursing sheep. Now the question is can you worm a nursing ewe, so the mother that's nursing the lambs?
You can. So that's a good question. So generally speaking, these worm species, they're really smart. They like to go dormant in late pregnancy. They stop feeding on that ewe and they stop shedding out eggs in the feces. So they kind of go quiet to trick that ewe into thinking they're not there. So if we are going to treat the pregnant ewe, if we think we have a worm issue, it's important to do that after lambing. You can do that to a lactating ewe, but again, remember that there's withdrawal times on these, and so obviously we're probably not going to be eating these ewes after we treat them, but that we follow those withdrawal times. Unfortunately, you can't really protect that lamb from parasites by treating the ewe. Some will be transferred in the milk, some of that compound, but it's not a good way of protecting those lambs, but it will protect the ewe and kill some of those worms.
Whit, can you explain what withdrawal time is?
Yeah, so anytime we administer a drug to the animal, the time that is required from the time we give that drug to when that animal is safe to consume or even sell for consumption, generally speaking, 21 to 45 days. With these dewormers, one thing that I'm seeing that I worry about a little bit is that we only approve oral dewormers, and if we inject a dewormer, we probably extend that withdrawal time or the time that that drug is in the tissue and in the system by about 3 to 4 times. And so that's why the injectable dewormers, I know that they're being used, but that's really critical that we know that we're kind of dealing with a risky proposition when we give injectable dewormers. So hopefully you're not drinking the milk of these ewes or butchering these ewes for consumption shortly after you've given a shot.
Okay, so the next question is a different topic. It says, is there any problem with housing a steer right next to a lamb? Can they share water? They're not going to be in the same pen. They're going to be separate pens, but they're going to share a water container.
Nope, that's no worry at all. Again, if you start to see that steer, there are some respiratory organisms that could give you problems if that steer is sick, but if both are healthy, I don't see any problem in that at all. And that could be a good form of companionship if you don't have another sheep in the pen. So no problem with that.
Okay, next question says, last year at fair, they had a really hard time keeping their lamb hydrated. They wouldn't drink the water. Is there anything that you can do to get them to drink other than Gatorade in the water or drenching?
Oh boy. Yeah, so I've oftentimes found that chlorinated water, as we bring sometimes onto a city water system, even with rams at ram sales, we have a real hard time keeping those rams hydrated. It may not be feasible, but filling up some jugs from your home ranch where they were consuming water, where they're used to that mineral profile, whether it's a hard water or they're used to consuming it, that would be my recommendation outside of flavoring the water and getting them to consume it that way. Again, I know that's hauling water in, but just remember that even though those lambs are used to being worked, when we move them to a new environment, behaviorally, that's like us going to school on the first day. We're nervous. We may not be as hungry. It changes a lot of things. And so being aware of that and preparing accordingly, I think, could be helpful.
What I was just going to add on there is that there's probably some maybe better products than Gatorade in the water, as well as there's actual electrolytes that are made specifically for livestock. And I think oftentimes they are maybe more appealing to animals. So like Blue Ribbon, there's a lot of different brands out there that will do it. And so I just, from personal experience, we had some goats that wouldn't drink at all. And we, even at home, and we ended up putting electrolytes in there, and that sure did increase that water intake. So
that's great. That's good.
Okay, so a couple more questions. Well, we have quite a few here. Back to worming. How often should you worm your lamb? And what really is your recommendation for what time of a wormer? Last year they didn't eat the pellets very good.
Okay, so my recommendation is we don't worm unless we need to. And I know that we all like the peace of mind of just treating them, even if they don't need it. But generally speaking, a fecal sample to your lab can tell you if you even need to go invest in a dewormer. I'd say 50% of the time, especially if they're not on lush pasture that's been irrigated, we don't have a worm burden. So if they've wormed them before you brought them back to your house, I'd say that's adequate. If they are grazing in a lush irrigated pasture where you think there may be worms, I'd say every 21 days you probably need to be worming. But I just don't think there's many of us grazing very wormy pastures out there. So my recommendation is to just pull a fecal sample or pick one up, put it in a plastic bag, take it down to your vet lab, and probably for $5 or $10 you can get an estimate if you even have a problem. But it's too easy sometimes to just want to treat without even having a problem. So I'd encourage that. I think the second part of that question was you must be using a Safeguard pellet. That's a dewormer pellet. The problem with the Safeguard, and that was some of the data that we've shown, is that those active ingredients aren't very effective anymore. So if you do have a worm problem, you probably should be using an ivermectin or a moxidectin instead of those Safeguard, those green pellets.
Perfect. All right, so that's all the questions that are in the chat box. Does anybody else have questions? Questions for Whit?
Dawn, I think your nutrition talk will touch on this, but for all of you, when you bring those lambs home, I think it's really important that you have some good grass hay for them. I think the tendency is to want, well, hopefully it's not to want to get them on a full grower pellet right away, but it's important to ask those questions, what kind of diet they've been on prior to coming to your place. And if you're trucking them a long ways, there's nothing wrong with getting them settled on a very soft grass hay or grass alfalfa hay during those rough transition times. So just remember to ask the CD&T vaccine question, to give a CD&T when they get home, but also to make sure that you're thinking about when you're going to be changing that diet so that you can avoid that greatest at-risk period for overeating disease.
Perfect. I think that's a great topic that Whit just hinged on. I think the other recommendation to go with that too is that if you're not raising your own and you're purchasing these lambs and bringing them in, is that you can always ask to purchase a half a bag of feed or whatever those lambs have been eating from the producer you're getting them from, and then take that and mix it with what you're going to transition on them. But Whit is concretely right that when you take those lambs and transition them, or just cold turkey, meaning you bring them home and you dump them on a brand new feed, is that oftentimes that can lead to some challenges. So there is another question that came into the chat box. It said, how long should you keep a new sheep away from maybe other sheep?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say a minimum of a 14-day quarantine period is pretty important. And if they did come from a large operation where you think they've had worm issues, that's a good time to treat them with a good product and clean them out and make sure that they're kind of isolated. Again, we know that sheep like to be together. So when I say isolation and quarantine, boy, that's easier said than done. But keeping them calm, but also just keeping them separate so they're not going to bring something into your flock, and kind of watching them closely in that 14-day period is pretty important. You know, quarantines, when we look at import-export requirements, especially across international boundaries, they're a lot longer. But I think if you're buying from which many of you are buying from a reputable source and they're transparent about their health protocol, you should be okay with a 14-day quarantine.
Perfect. That's a great question. Any other questions? All right. I just had a thought that just came to me after that question came up with, is that there's probably a good thought process that if you're bringing those animals from out of state, that you maybe watch the Wyoming law in terms of having health inspections on those. So
Absolutely.
We're working on a brochure, actually it should come out soon, that is just in the proofing stage, but just remember, as you're purchasing new sheep, if they're being imported into the state of Wyoming, you will need to have a health inspection from the vet, from the people you're purchasing from needs to provide that health inspection for you. as well as that you guys will need to get a brand inspection even in the state. If you're buying them from other producers within the state, you'll need to get the brand inspection. So that really wasn't on the topic for tonight, but since it got brought up, I think that that's probably a good rule of thumb to kind of put in the back of your mind. So any other questions? All right, I think this has been great. I'm super thankful for Whit and being able to share his knowledge with you guys. He has a lot of expertise in this whole worming concept and the projects that he's working on. And so I think that we're very fortunate to have be able to tap into him and learn from him. And so with that, we're gonna, Whit'll stay on just for a few more minutes, is that we're just gonna move to the door prizes. If you guys have been on the last couple of workshops, is I do have some door prizes to give tonight. And so that just gives a moment for anybody else that maybe has a question can interrupt and pipe up. But I'm gonna have Whit stop sharing his screen.